Hello, Erica here. Obviously, this is my channel. Today I'm going to be going through the books that I read in April and reviewing each one very briefly and letting you know kind of what I thought of all the books that were on my TBR and yeah, just kind of what I thought. So without further ado, let's get into it. I read a total of 15 books this past month, which is, I think, on like a tie for the most books I've ever read in a month, which is great. It was a surprisingly good reading month for me. There were phases where I got really sucked into reading just like book after book after book, and then there were still a few like periods of time, like a couple of days where I was reading less and could kind of like take a break from reading so that I could jump back into it a few days later. So to get started with the fiction stack, the book that I liked the least this month was The Snow Gypsy by Lindsay Jane Ashford. I read this book towards the end of the month and ended up doing that thing where it's kind of the equivalent of a DNF for me, where I get about like halfway to 2/3 of the way in and then I'm like, I can't do this anymore, and I just like skim read the rest of the book. So I think, yeah, I don't know. I kind of got thrown off by this book because it is pitched as two women who are trying to get into the truth of what happened to them and their families during the war. This takes place right after World War II. One of the main characters is trying to find her brother and like find out what happened to him when he died in the war. He reported having a child but then died before like she could meet the child. And the second main character is a woman who is trying to escape her memories of what happened during the war. Part of what has happened is that she came across a bunch of dead bodies and a living child among them and adopted the child as her own. And so I thought it would be this really interesting trek of these two women getting to know each other and like having differences, but really, I don't know, it was very strange. It was just a bunch of like trips of convenience, and then like one of the main characters just got like sidelined for most of the book. And the daughter, like the child main character, got just like shipped off with the other woman, and there was like a weird love plot there towards the end, which I did not really read. I just couldn't find the characters very believable, and I wasn't super compelled by finding out what they were doing. Also, and I was worried about this when I started this book, I didn't feel like I really believed that the author could be telling those stories and like really understood the culture that she was trying to portray, and so it just kind of all felt very like whimsical and not super nuanced to me. So yeah, I didn't love it. It's on my Goodreads. You can see why I didn't love it in more detail there. The next book to discuss is Emergency Contact by Mary H.K. Choi. I liked this book just fine. I thought that I really enjoyed some of the pieces of it. I felt fine about the two main characters. So this is a love story about a young girl who has just gone to college for the first time and a guy who works at the coffee shop at that college, and he dropped out and is now just kind of struggling to make ends meet and not really sure where his life is going. And the two of them end up meeting and becoming like text buddies, and they like develop a friendship and then something deeper based on their relationship via text, which is really interesting because it was a nice way to think about like how relationships are digital and how they can be taken on over long distances and what intimacy can look like when you're not face to face with a person. So I really appreciated that as a premise. There are just some things that I didn't like about the way the book was told, and like while I think other booktubers have done a lot more work kind of ripping this book apart, and I'm not going to do that, I definitely saw like there are some just problematic lines in there, and also one of the big premises of the book is like one of the characters has a panic attack in public and the other main character comes across them, and just like that's how their relationship really begins. And I like, as a person who's had panic attacks before, it just like it felt like a realistic representation of what that feels like, but it also felt like a weird, I don't know, it felt very much like a plot device, and I didn't really like the use of a panic attack as a plot device. And yeah, there's just some like serious life issues used as plot premises that just made me kind of uncomfortable, and so it was hard for me to get really into it. Yeah. Now we're getting into the books that I did really like. So the next book I pulled, and this was a really hard decision, like the next three are kind of all on the same level for me. I read Dread Nation by Justina Ireland. This is a book about an alternative history set in around the Civil War era, and the idea is that the North and the South are in the middle of this fight, and then the dead start rising and become like zombies, and the Civil War ends in order to fight all of these zombies, and now we're in the aftermath kind of this original like zombie versus human war, where black girls like our main character Jane are used as kind of hired bodyguards to fight the zombies that are still around. It's a really interesting premise, and the characters are really great. I liked both the main characters, Jane and Catherine. I don't know what I was expecting, but I kind of like, I don't know, I liked the book just fine. I wasn't completely blown away. I did really like the way that Ireland was able to imagine this world and like realistically portray what it would have been like to and handled the racism of the era and handled the kind of political and economic power struggle in this alternative setting. It just felt very like deeply well done, and so that I really appreciated. I think I would have liked to see more from the plot. There was a lot of just like exploring the setting and like a lot of world building being done, which works, but I also, yeah, I think I wanted a little bit more out of like the characters interacting with each other, and yeah, I think that's what I wanted. Next book I picked out is The Female Persuasion by Meg Wolitzer. This was originally not on my TBR for this month, but I brought it to my house during stay-home reading rush, where I also read Dread Nation, The Snow Gypsy, and this. Anyways, I read The Female Persuasion during stay-home reading rush, and really enjoyed about the first 2/3, and then the last 1/3 fell a little flat for me. I loved the descriptions of being new to college and really afraid of like party culture and not really wanting to engage in that, but also wanting to make friends, and the sort of tension that the main character feels about not getting into the school of her choice by no fault of her own. Like she gets into the school of her choice and then has to pass up the offer because of financial aid packages, and I don't know, it's a very interesting story about a girl named Greer who comes into contact with this kind of feminist icon named Faith, and it's about like Greer being taken under Faith's wing and kind of beginning her career in sort of this like, it's very like white middle class feminism, and they're very like, they're very aware of that, and it's very reflexive in that way, and yeah, it's just about Greer kind of rising into this culture of like feminist magazine and like activism, but then also having to deal with the like really difficult sort of realities of what it is to be an activist in that space at this time, which is modern day pretty much, and like how to deal with some of the less ethical things that make really good work possible. I thought the ending, basically, to not spoil anything, there's like some really big stuff that happens to each of the characters around 2/3 of the way through the book, and for a lot of them it's kind of like a fall from grace moment, and we see that happen and we really feel for the characters and we see them kind of overcoming their internal challenges and all, and then all of a sudden there's just like a hasty resolution of things, and you kind of see hints that the characters are going to pick up the pieces of their lives, but you don't really get to see how. You just get to see like a flash forward 2 years later, and there we are. And I really would have wanted to see more of like growing those relationships back together and picking up the pieces of this fallout. I really wanted to see more, because I think that's where a lot of character growth happens, and so yeah, that's kind of what I thought about this. Then we have The Masked City by Genevieve Cogman. This is the second book in the Invisible Library series. It follows a interdimensional kind of spy team as they go through all of these different like parallel universes in order to collect copies of books that only exist in that parallel, and it's a really interesting world where there are like dragons who represent order and fae who represent chaos, and they exist on the spectrum, or like the different realities exist on a spectrum between order and chaos, and so the main character is always kind of figuring out the stakes and the setting of the world that she's in, and moving through those kind of like laws that are different based on whether the world is aligned to order and chaos. In this book that really comes into play, because we spend a lot of the time in the book in a very like chaos heavy world, and so the book introduces us to all these new ideas and rules and kind of twists on how gravity and coincidence and fate really play a different, like, have different rules than they would in like worlds that we might understand as our own. This is just like a really fun, action-packed book. I had a great time with it. It's a light-hearted read, but you do really get connected to the characters. The main character, Irene, is like a class act. She's so great, and I really have strong pictures of the characters in my head, and I really liked the way that the plot worked in this. I loved the sort of sacrifices and deals that Irene has to make in order to get through the challenges that are set ahead for her. So yeah, this is definitely one of my favorites this month. 3 books I read in April was the Arc of the Scythe Trilogy by Neil Shusterman. This set of books takes place in a future where we have figured out how to stop people from dying, and we have figured out regeneration, but in order to keep the world from like overpopulating and running out of resources, there are people designated as scythes who can kill people, and their job is to kill people, and different scythes take on the job of killing in different ways. We follow a set of characters who are apprenticed to one of the scythes who makes it his purpose to kind of make sure that the way he gives out death is proportional or equivalent to like the statistics of how people died in the mortal age, so it's as realistic as possible. But there are other scythes in the community who are taking on this power as an excuse to kind of like kill people as they would like, and are finding ways to gain power and skirt the rules about like mercy and like making killing into a sport instead of like this kind of sacred and unfortunate duty that is required for the world's continued existence. So we follow these 2 main characters, Citra and Rowan, as they are apprentices and as they grow up and take on their separate paths in this universe where there's a lot at stake. This is a very high concept set of novels. I really enjoyed them. I had a really good time. I was really worried about halfway through the first book that I would not like it, and then it really just like picked up for me. One of the things I really respect about this series is the way that Shusterman always kind of sets a clock very early on in the story where we think things are building up to, and then that like clock set point, that like countdown moment, is only like 2/3 the way through the book, so there's still a lot of action that happens afterwards that I really enjoyed because it always keeps you on your toes. It kind of keeps you guessing like, oh god, if this is what we've been counting down towards and there's still like 1/3 of the book to go, what's gonna happen next? So I really enjoyed the twists and turns in this series. I think my favorite book of the trio is the second one, Thunderhead, because it does a really good job of getting into the world of the scythes as a whole. It explores, especially I think, Citra's character really well, and also introduces us to the like very strange religious cult that is also in existence at this world, and also the group of people who are interpreters of the big AI cloud known as the Thunderhead, which controls the actions of the world, and like controls the regeneration process and controls like information processes and all of that. Yeah, this is a really interesting series. It's a very fun take on what like immortality would look like, and why like humans are and like the weaknesses and strengths of humans, and kind of like what humans would do if given the power to kind of live forever or like live almost indefinitely. Oh, the one thing I didn't believe, the main romance of the book didn't work for me. I just like did not believe it. I was like, I believed that they were friends, but I could not, it's set up so that they are like madly in love with each other and would do anything for each other, and it just like didn't seem like that to me, like at all. It really just seemed like 2 characters have like a mutual admiration for each other and are like friends, but it was confusing to me that they would go to all the lengths that they would just for like love of the other, because like I didn't see that at all. But the last fiction book that I want to talk about, y'all saw this coming, it's The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. This is a story of Locke Lamora, who is a con man slash like criminal in this underbelly of society in this like medieval city setting that we're in. His whole thing is that he pulls off very elaborate cons to rob rich people of huge swaths of wealth, and then he sticks it in his like house and then doesn't know what to do with it after that. It's fun. But anyways, he's keeping this secret from most people in his life. A lot of people don't even know that he has this hoard of wealth, and he gets dragged into this elaborate scheme where he has to pretend to be a huge threat to his own society and like pull off this very elaborate con in order to like both save and destroy the city and kind of upend how everything is going. And he's just kind of forced to do it, and it's highly entertaining. I enjoyed so much that Locke and the other characters that are surrounding Locke feel like humans with full capabilities and potential. They have complex emotions and are able to talk about those emotions in a way that I think books about like tough, cool, street smart guys aren't often given the chance to do. And also I really liked that Locke like is capable of error and is capable of being like completely out of his league, and he knows that and recognizes that, and there are moments that are just like so tragic because of that. I'm really excited to read the next 2 books in this trilogy. I'm really looking forward to getting the next 2, and yeah, we'll see what I think of them in the future. So most of the books I read that were nonfiction this month I read on audiobook, and I don't actually rate books that I read on audiobook really, because it's kind of like hard for me to really like say that I read them, because it's just a different experience for me, because I'm usually doing something else while I'm listening, and so it feels more like a podcast to me than anything else. But anyways, the one book that I did read that is physical is Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks. This is a book that essentially shows how technology has advanced in order to help make like welfare programs and like restrictions for applying for welfare and that sort of thing more like automatic and quote-unquote efficient. But it shows like how we've just reintroduced methods of like surveillance and oppression into the lives of poor people, and are just making poor people jump through more hoops for pretty much no reason, taking out a lot of the like care from it. The examples in this book are really chilling, and like I thought really good work in terms of seeing the realities for people. I think I wanted more like aggressive solution at like arguing from this book, and so I wasn't like completely taken with it, if that makes sense. But I think that's just because like I'm more into like grander political books, and this was more like a case study, a set of case studies. And yeah, it's really interesting and pretty short if you're interested in that sort of thing. It has a lot of really chilling testimonies from people who've been screwed by all of this like automation as it stands to just regulate how poor people live their lives. So I DNF'd 2 books this month, 2 audiobooks, not because I wasn't liking them, but because I was feeling like I wasn't getting any more out of them than what I'd already started. So one of these books was White Fragility, which is right here. This is a book for white people about how to not be racist. And it is a book about how white people get super offended by the idea of being white and why that is, and makes note that like folks who are white have never been like deemed such, and are uncomfortable by that marking of race, and why it is so like embedded in white society to just kind of like gloss over race and be like colorblind. And it's a really important, I think, deconstruction of all of those ideas. I stopped listening to it, I think about halfway through, or maybe a little more than that, because I started feeling like the examples and like points that the author was making were things that I'd already heard from other places, and so I was just not getting anything out of it anymore, because I was feeling like I could tell what the point was before she would even get to it, just because of like I've already done some like research and work in this field, and so I'm like pretty aware of some of the ideas that are going on here, and so I thought it was a really good book. If you don't know much about, if you are a white person and you really don't know much about like race theory and racial equity, I recommend it. It's a really good book that kind of criticizes and critiques the sort of things that like white people just do every day and acknowledge as normal. And so in that way, I think it's really important if you are like relatively new to the racial equity space. Like it's a necessary read, but like I stopped feeling like I was getting new knowledge out of it, if that makes sense. The next book I DNF'd is The Witches Are Coming by Linda West, I think is her name. This book is about the sort of idea that the Me Too movement and that like more women coming forward about their experiences being treated poorly by men is turning into like a witch hunt, quote unquote, and the way that like men are reacting to being accused of these things, and Again, I DNF'd it not because it wasn't a good read, but just like because I wasn't in a mental place where I could just like think about that all the time. Like thinking about like men getting away with things that they really should not be getting away with but are continuing to do so because they just have power is like really upsetting to me. And so it's hard for me to read or like listen to stories where that happens over and over again without just like feeling really grimy and upset. Even though the book is handled in a very like lighthearted, sarcastic way and is very good at making getting its points across, I just like it put me into too difficult of a headspace for me to continue, and so I just didn't. 3 books I did finish though. The Triumph of Injustice. This is a book about how the rich dodge taxes in various ways, and also provides some explanation of like how taxes have changed over history and what policies could actually be put into place in order to close some of the loopholes that you always hear about when talking about tax policy. So this was a really interesting read for me as someone who is constantly trying to think about ways in which we could realistically change the way that redistribution happens in terms of tax policy. And yeah, I loved the solutions that were offered, and I love the like very cutting analysis of like how tax loopholes were invented and how businesses and rich individuals have continually gotten away with essentially freeloading off of the rest of us and like hiding behind this veneer of kind of attainable success when really it's not that. Yeah, I thought this was a super interesting book, and I really appreciated that it got into some technical elements that like I didn't know previously and taught me something in a way as like how I can make sort of abstract ideas and hopes for the future into concrete solutions that we can actually implement. That was really helpful for me. The next book that I read is The Great Departure by Tara Zara. This is a history of emigration from Eastern European countries, mostly to America, but also to Western Europe, and with a focus on what the stories of the people who were leaving actually were, and why those people were leaving, and like what different motivations there were for leaving, and how countries tried to stop people from coming or like invite people, and how countries where a lot of people were leaving tried to either get rid of undesirable citizens or tried to keep as many people as possible. I'm really interested in migration history. It's one of the things I want to study in grad school, and so this book was just right up my alley. I really enjoyed the focus on individual people's experiences in leaving and how individual people experience this sort of government messaging about population control and about desirable ethnic populations and desirable working populations. That's all just very interesting stuff to me, and so I just had a very good time with the book. Yeah, I felt like I was learning a lot and could definitely see how that like history was an important one to be told. And I thought like a lot of migrant history focuses, I think, on incoming immigrants and less on people leaving and why people leave. And so I thought this was a really interesting reversal in that way. The last nonfiction book that I read this month is This Is Chance by this guy. This is a story about an earthquake in Anchorage, Alaska in the 1960s, I believe, and the story of one journalist who essentially got on the radio for hours and hours and hours and helped calm the nerves of the people in her town. And it's a story about like how she was a like working woman with a family, and how like the tension of being a woman who is very ambitious in her career while also wanting to be like the responsible and like maternal 1960s mother figure at the same time, and how she was balancing those. It's also about the play Our Town, and the whole story of like this event, this earthquake, and the aftermath of it is told in a way that kind of mirrors the play Our Town, which is like a really interesting piece because it was being put on in the town like the same weekend. There was like a whole lot of meta-analysis going on there, and it was very interesting in that way. I thought, yeah, the format of the book and the form of the book is the most interesting part. I did think I was looking to it more as a way to learn about how communities come together after disaster, and so there were portions towards the end that got into like the sociology behind it that I found super interesting, but for the most part it's a story about a couple of individuals, and so like that was less of the story that I came in wanting to get. But yeah, I still like really recommend this just for how interestingly the story was told, and how like weirdly meta it was. That was just like highly entertaining to me. So those are the books that I read in April. I also read Cinder, but I reread that book, so I didn't include it in this wrap-up. So you can find my full review of Cinder in the info box. And that is it for this April wrap-up. I hope that you find my hot takes interesting and that you might have picked up a book or know to stay away from a book based on the things I've said. Let me know if you've read any of these books and you agree and disagree with me. You can also check out what I'm reading in May in the little info box, and we can continue to discuss all of the books. That is all from me. Have a wonderful rest of your days and take care.